So a very welcome to Professor Conti, who is a professor at the Institute of Economics, University of Campinas. And let us also remind you, while the session is going on, please keep your microphone muted. And unless we started to open for discussion, questions, you can either use the raise up function, or you just, since we have small groups, so you can just raise your hand up, and it's very flexible. So to begin, we have two questions with each coming out from the discussion access under the video lecture. So I shall go with the first question. So Professor, how did developed countries manage to take away the ladder in a situation that developing countries are already aware of? And they denying the developing countries access to the same policies which they use to industrialize. Since some of our course participants accused of policies such as liberalizations, deregulations, free trade, low tariffs, etc., that had been preached or even required by many international organizations or institutions, such as WTO, IMF, World Bank, Washington Consensus. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'd like to thank Edlira again for the invitation and for the organization of this MOOC, very interesting MOOC, and to thank also Chen Li for giving me the floor. And it's a great pleasure for me to meet him. We were together at the University of Campinas for some years, right? And after that, I hadn't not seen Chen Li again, so it's a great pleasure for me to meet you. And it's a pleasure to meet you all as well. Later, it would be nice for me to listen from you. Where are you from? As far as I understood, Tia is from Jakarta, Philip from Cape Town, and then later on, you can also tell me where are you from. It's also good for our discussions because the country cases, the national cases are always important to illustrate what you are here discussing in general terms. So now coming to the first question, which is a very important question. Well, at the end, if the central countries, they are kicking away the ladder, how come that the underdeveloped countries or peripheral countries, they accept that their ladder is being kicked away? So in order to, I'll follow Edlira's recommendation and I'll give a short answer, but then I'll open the floor for you if you want to continue on this issue, which is obviously an issue unlimited. We can discuss it for hours and hours. But well, to start the discussion, I would say that we have to understand that there are two parallel and imbricated movements. One movement comes in, let's say, an ideational ground. So it comes with the enforcement of some ideologies, right? And then one first ideology, obviously, is the free market one. So there are discussions being made by many scholars in the whole world and also in the multilateral institutions and in the media that, for instance, industrial policy disturbs the natural movements of a market economy, so it prevents the optimal allocation of resources. So it's better, it would be better for us to just leave free market if you want to avoid misallocation of resources. There is also a discourse that, well, industrial policy is always embedded in corruption, because what they say is that whenever we have to choose for strategic sectors or strategic firms in order to develop the industrial policy, then we would be amidst private interests, and then industrial policy would be embedded in corruption. So there is also this blah, blah, blah. And the ironic thing is that even in the so-called liberal order of the late 19th century, state intervention was the rule. So you see that it comes in this ideational ground, but in practice, what they did, the central countries at the end of the 19th century, and also they keep doing, is doing industrial policy. We can come back to this point later. Another let's say, of this ideology is that we benefit from the specialization in the sectors in which we have natural advantages, right? So it comes from David Ricardo, from the beginning of the 19th century, the benefits of the so-called international division of labor. The idea is that, well, if in Brazil we have natural resources, we'd better be specialized in agriculture and mining. And it's nonsense for us to develop industry because we can benefit from industrial sectors through free trade. This is the idea of the international division of labor. This is the idea of David Ricardo and the new theoretics of these benefits of specialization. These ideologies is still very strong in Brazil. We have people advocating for that finally industry is not a special sector. What they say is that, well, industry is a sector as any other. So if we are we have these natural resources, we'd better concentrate on that and then import industrial sectors. But we know that, well, industry is not a sector like any other. It's a special sector, and we have a whole literature on that. In industry, we tend to have better jobs. In literature, in industry, industry is the locus for technological development. In industry, we have linkages which are stronger than in the other sectors, precisely to the other sectors, so to agriculture and to service. Industry or having a national industry is a question of sovereignty. So now in this context of the pandemic, we see how important it is even to have, well, not only the vaccine, but also the other medical equipments necessary for the vaccine and so on. And also what is important to contradict this ideology is that, well, the advantages, when we say that we have to benefit from advantages, so we have in Brazil natural advantages, we are looking only to what we name as the static advantages. So we have advantages in this precise moment in history, in terms of producing soybeans, for instance. But what we see in the countries which made the catching up is that their advantages have been built over time. All right. So in USA, in Germany, and now in China, it's not a question of having natural advantages. It's a question of constructing these advantages in high-tech sectors, for instance. All right. So, well, just to finish with this first block, let's say, which tries to impose or try to kick the ladder by convincing us through this ideational ground that it's not a good idea to do industrial policy. So this is the first, let's say, the first block. But then obviously there is a parallel and imbricated movement in the material ground, which is very, very important. And in the material ground, some of you have already responded to the question by bringing some elements, as Chen Li has said in the beginning. So we have coercion for the adoption of these neoliberal ideas. And these neoliberal ideas are many times they are concretely implemented through the rules of multilateral institutions, so IMF, World Bank, and so on. Or, and this is important to mention, it's even worse through bilateral agreements. And not only on trade, but also on investments. So those agreements, we talk a lot about the trade agreements, but also the investment agreements are very restrictive in terms of the possibilities for countries to develop industrial policy. Under the coordination of Christopher Scherer and Hans-Jörg Herr, we made a study for Industrial. I saw that any of you, Celso Gonzalez, I don't remember. No, Ramon Certeza. I see that your background, so you probably work for Industrial. And we made a study for industrial, and we are realized that the bilateral agreements tend to be even more restrictive than the multilateral ones in what regards development policies, industrial policies. So if the WTO, for instance, gives some space for industrial policy, then whenever we have an agreement like the one made by Mexico with the US and Canada, the restrictions to industrial policy are much tighter, but much stronger. All right. And there is a list. I will mention it here, but then if you want, we can develop some of those topics. Obviously, taxes. So whenever we have these bilateral agreements, then there is the tendency, at least, for equalization of taxes or non-taxes at all for free trade, as you know. One very important topic: intellectual property. Those agreements, bilateral agreements, normally they impose a lot of restrictions when they try to impose a defense for intellectual property, which is made in the center countries, but it's not very appropriated to follow the same rules in the periphery, in the global south, when they have precisely to do this catching up process. You can imagine, for instance, the USA, France, and Germany industrialization wouldn't be able to industrialize so quickly there back in the 19th century if they had to respect intellectual property rights related to a steam machine, for instance. Obviously not. So when we have the imposition of intellectual property rights for global southern countries, it's obviously a restriction for the catching up process. Then we have restrictions also over public procurements, which has been used historically for industrial sectors. So buying, obviously public expenditure is a large part of the GDP in all countries. So if the government buys from a specific sector or specific firms, like national firms, it can develop an industrial policy strategy through these public procurements. Then subsides as well in taxes or credit, rules related to nationally produced inputs, and so on. Exchange rate manipulation. So in this treaty I just mentioned, between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, the new NAFTA, let's say, it has a clause about the exchange rate. And well, exchange rate manipulation has been always a tool for industrial policy. So just to finish, the labor unions have a very important role to play precisely in following the discussions related to these agreements, these bilateral agreements. I know the space provided for discussions changes a lot from country to country. We made some interviews for this study made for industrial. And then for Colombia, for instance, it's very hard. The government does not allow the labor unions to express, or at least they do not invite the labor unions to discussions related to bilateral agreements. In Brazil, currently the same. But in other countries, there is more space. And we also saw that for the labor unions in countries where there is no dialogue with the government, it's important to count on the struggle of comrades in other countries. So, for instance, again, in this agreement, Mexico, Canada, US, Mexican labor unions could count on the struggle of the American or Canadian comrades. For Brazil, European Union, the same. Brazilians are counting a lot on the struggles of the European labor unions and so on. Because indeed these agreements are long-lasting and may strongly constrain the space for industrial policy. So that's it. I would say that those are the main ways through which the central countries are kicking away the ladder, and the global south is having hard times to hold the ladder, let's say.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much for the very systematic analysis for us. And yes, we have actually already talked quite many of the aspects in terms of international sphere, in terms of trade, in terms of other agreements. as you also highlighted. And maybe later, if it depends on our conversation. Now we are open for questions and comments. So you can use the raise up function, or you just raise your hand. We can already start our discussion. Yes, Philip, please.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Bruno. Okay, I'm interested if you can. I've heard of this relationship between South Africa and Brazil. In Brazil, this relationship of the gap between the rich and the poor. That if South Africa is not the first, then Brazil is the second. Like they alternate like that. That there's a huge gap. These two countries, there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And then I would like if you can tell me what could be the factors of this relationship. Okay. Also here in South Africa, during the World Cup. Okay. And then which it was not. It was not impartially consulted with the trade unions and the workers. It was unilaterally decided between the this neoliberal government and then also it's the agencies of trade, World Trade Organization, IMF, and so on. And then we resulted having the World Cup. Maybe it was good to have a World Cup, but okay, here, the money which was meant to build houses for basic social, basic services, now it was redirected towards the building of stadiums. And then the companies, the multi-corporation companies during building of these stadiums benefited. And then again, the hosting of the World Cup in South Africa, the multi-corporation companies benefited. So everyone, and then leaving everyone very poor. Apparently, we are still paying back the debt of which was the result of 2010. And then I don't know if it's the same with Brazil, since in Brazil, you are also very much into soccer. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Philip. Yes, floor is yours, Professor.
So thank you very much, Philip, for your questions. And indeed, we have a lot of similarities between Brazil and South Africa. And one of them, it's not, let's say, a happy similarity, but still, is the one about inequality. It comes, and we have to say that always, it comes from the colonial legacy, obviously. We have both been colonies in which, and then even some 100 years, in the case of Brazil, we have the independence. Next year, we will celebrate 100 years of independence. But still, our society has been conformed in a way that we still feel this colonial legacy. And one of them is precisely the one of inequality between rich and poor, the racial inequality and so on, and the same in South Africa. And then, how to deal with that? Obviously, we have to develop social policies. And then a lot of them we can discuss it, but we can have minimum wage policies, increasing minimum wage policies, basic income policy, and so on. But then I'll try to bring again to our discussion here. Industrial policy is certainly one of the policies which may help a country to deal with the inequalities, because as I said, industry tends, it's not we do have exceptions, but it tends to create jobs in the formal sector, and it tends to create jobs which are more protected, let's say, at least more than the jobs, let's say, in agriculture and these very basic services. So developing industry in Brazil, we had a moment in which we have a kind of success in our industrialization process. We can talk about that for the second question, but then it's really frustrating what happened in the last 40 years, let's say. So revamping industry in Brazil and doing the same in South Africa is certainly a way of dealing with these inequalities in order to create better jobs, but also in order to, in the middle to long term, let's say, put the country again in the rails of development, which can bring benefits to the whole society. So this is my first response. And then as for the World Cup, we had the same problems in Brazil. It's not by chance that we had in 2013, so it was not even the World Cup, but the Confederations Cup, which precedes the World Cup. We had very intensive movements. I guess Chen Li was already here, I'm not sure. But we have the so-called June journeys, in which massive amounts of people went to the streets precisely to ask, against, so Brazilians are passionate with soccer, but still they were against the World Cup and the Confederations Cup, because they were saying, well, the FIFA quality is not can't be valid only for stadiums, but it has to be valid for public education, for instance, transportation, and so on. So that there was an insatisfaction with the World Cup in Brazil, and with the legacy of this World Cup, because it's true that in some countries, the Olympic Games and the World Cup did have a good legacy due to the construction of infrastructure, for instance. But this was not the case in Brazil. We could have used this moment in order to develop or to ameliorate the public transportation. But it was rather concentrated in ameliorating airports, for instance, and ameliorating the stadiums. So there were some choices that at the end made us lost the possibility of using the World Cup in order to improve the infrastructure, the tourism infrastructure. Again, trying to bring the discussion to industrial policy again. We could have used the World Cup in order to benefit some strategic sectors which are necessary for industry. When I'm talking about infrastructure, one of the main problems in many global South countries is precisely the infrastructure. Even in the hypothetical situation in which we can have very productive firms, for instance, we do lose competitiveness due to the lack of infrastructure, because in order to bring the goods to a port or to an airport, but mostly to a port, we have to use roads which are costly, and so on. So just to let you know that the World Cup could have been used to develop infrastructure, which would be also good for industry, but we lost these possibilities.
Yes, great, thanks, Professor. That's exactly the concrete example, as you also highlighted, unregulated FDI inflows or investment flows. If we are not going to regulate it, actually does not benefit the public at the end. Also does not actually contribute to the development of industry, or in a certain sense. Yes, so Professor, yeah, please, Raman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Bruno, for sharing your ideas about industrial policy. Well, for me, it is really a good reader when you read about Ha Yun Chang's Kicking Away the Ladder. So it learns much about how those industrialized economies develop their own economy, where they supposed to lead other economies, or this developing economy, to take the pattern of their own level of development. But unfortunately, like Ha Yun Chang's metaphor, they tend to kick away the ladder of development for the others to really not to catch up their greatness or highness that they reach at the top. It seems that many of the developing economies are tend to take the same pattern, but well, in the development of a global economy, wherein international financial institutions take the lead in providing some policies that, of course, a neoliberal policies that prevents developing economy to have a space to push for their own industrial development. Like they tend to open up the economy, free trade, liberalization, deregulation, and even privatization of sectors that are really important for an economy. So it hinders really the development of those less developing economies that supposedly should follow the pattern the way they have in the past. For example, in the Philippines, we have been try to emulate by way of developing our critical sector during the 70s and early 80s. Like, for example, we have a government industry that was protected under the quota, wherein in those multi-fiber agreement period, wherein we have an assured export market. And another sector that have a potential during those time was the electronic sector. But during also those period, our country did not really upgrade, meaning they just stick on the low value added production of those sector. Even though they have at that time planned to industrialize by but of course the problem is the capital. We don't have capital, but instead we rely on foreign borrowing. So that's why we also have this trillions of pesos that are still indebted to international financial institutions. But I think that there is still some way for the state to industrialize our economy, but it was being prevented by, of course, the policies that that hinders to push for more economic development. So, do you think that at this point, at this period, that do you think that there are still some space for the developing economies to that's available in the given context of global economic integration? So, do we still have some a chance or potential to upgrade or to develop, given that I just like to take the example of what happened in China. Of course, is very exceptional case. The population, they have the money, but what happened in the shortage of microchip that are used in electronic vehicles? So we have in any way has been integrated into global supply chain. So there's still some potential in clustering. For example, China, with Philippines near in China, we can also produce chips, microchip. But of course, China is one global factory that very difficult to penetrate, for example. So what are still available policy instruments that we can develop given this context of global economic integration? Thank you.
Well, it's a very, very, very interesting and complex question. Actually, it's the question we are all trying to cope with. And then it's totally related, Chendi, with the second question. I don't know if I go to the second question and then we come back to Fabiola's question, Or
yeah. Maybe I was also actually thinking to make that proposal. So let me also put the second question from our discussion access. So it's very similar to Raman asked, and I think since this is our last session on the industrial policy, I think that's a very urgent question. Everyone wants to know. So most of developing countries have tried to implement some industrial policies over a certain period of their development. Like Raman was talking in 1970s, 80s, which Philippines would try. However, very few has managed to achieve industrialization. So what are the common obstacles when implementing industrial policies, especially in the countries of the global south? As many of our course participants attributed, such as the over-dependency of external capital, inefficiency of the protected infant sector, incomplete economic sovereignty, so on and so forth. Yeah, please, Professor, it's your floor.
Okay, thank you very much. It's indeed an excellent question, like Ramon's one, and but Ramon focused rather in the possibilities, right? And this question is rather in the failures, let's say. So I'll try to cope with both together. Well, we have, in order to analyze the failures, both the failures and the possibilities, we have to go case by case, obviously, country by country. But there are certainly some common aspects which have made it hard for the global south to industrialize, or at least to reach some level of development in this industrialization process. And then one first common aspect, the financial dimension. So industrialization needs a long-term financing, okay, which will not be provided by the private sector in the global south. Because it depends also on the sector, but for some sectors, the return is quick, but from some others related to infrastructure, related to, let's say, boats, navios, Chenli, I don't know how, but the Navy industry, you can see that it's really long-term. So we have to have a structure for long-term financing, all right? And since the private sector won't provide long-term financing in the global south, we have to have public financing. So just to go to Ramon's question and then the possibilities. The development of banks are really important. It's true that not every country can create a development bank, but we do have examples in which those development banks, public development banks, have played a crucial role. In Brazil, for instance. And then you can ask, but how to create a development bank? You have to have long-term funding. And then in Brazil, I'll just give the example of Brazil, and then we have to analyze case by case. We have some taxes related to labor. So they are paid by the companies, but they are related to the workers, right? Which compose a fund for support to the workers. Within this fund, we get money, for instance, to pay for the unemployment insurance. Okay, so this fund, which is composed by the taxes paid by all companies in all formal jobs, this fund, 60% of it, more or less, is directed to this development bank, which is BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. So it was a way created some decades ago in order to allocate funds for this development bank in order to have long-term financing, all right? So this is one possibility in some countries, and it's really important, because otherwise, and then we come to the failures, otherwise, if the financing is not public, it has to come from abroad. And then we have the external debt, which is a problem for most global south countries. The external debt is not a problem if the world economy is in a moment with abundance of liquidity. It's the technical term. So we have money chasing yield and going to the periphery of the world. But capitalism, as you know, functions within cycles. And then we have moments in which we have abundance of credit for the periphery of the world. But then whenever there is a change in the market sentiment, we have the reflow. So we have the lack of funding for the periphery of the world. And this created, for instance, the big crisis of the 80s in the so-called third world at that time. Latin America was one of the regions mostly hit by this crisis. So in the 70s, we received a lot of credit from the central countries. And then in 79, more precisely, due to a change in the monetary policy in the US, this liquidity cycle entered in a downward phase. We have a lack of funding. And then we have the external debt crisis in Brazil, in Mexico, in all Latin America, and also in other continents. So just to say that depending on external financing is very dangerous, okay? So it shows the importance of having a public banks and public long-term financing. A second point, a country may get external capital through other means than only debt. So through FDIs, for instance, Chandy has just mentioned the foreign direct investments. And there are indeed some benefits arising from FDIs. So access to dollars, it's the first one. When it's a greenfield investment, the so-called greenfield investment, we have the creation of new firms, new plants of production. We have creation of jobs. And very importantly, we have access to the technology that is being created in the whole world. So through FDIs, we can have machines, for instance, that were created in other parts of the world and so on. So it may be, what I want to highlight is that it may be part of the industrialization process, the industrialization strategy, having FDIs. But when it's made with a lack of control from the government, there are lots of problems because it tends to go to sectors in which there are the static advantages that I mentioned earlier. So the FDI coming to Brazil will come to produce soybeans, and to South Africa it will go to the mining sector. It tends to avoid sharing technology. So the technology is created in the center countries, but it is not shared with the periphery. In some case, in some limited case, it may be the FDI to create firms only for assemblements. So the maquilas in Mexico, so assembling companies. And then a very important thing, which also is related to Ramon's question. The FDIs, normally they are directed by interests which are alien, let's say, to the country which receives the capital. There is a very important economist in Brazil, he already passed away, Celso Furtado, maybe some of you have heard about him. And the name he gives for this process is the externalization of the decision centers. At the end, the relevant decisions related to a national economy are taken by the headquarters of the firms, which have obviously nothing to do with the national interests of the receiving country. And this is that's why it's particularly dangerous to open some strategic sectors for FDI, such as water provision, energy infrastructures as a whole. Okay, so this is one important dimension of what you had named as incomplete economic sovereignty. When you made the question, read the question, he already gave some responses, and this one was one of them. But see, and then we come back also to the possibilities. No, it's not fair to be blaming only foreign capital, multinational companies. They are doing their job. I mean, we have to take into consideration also that notably in the global south, an important part, what is commonly named as an elite, the national elite, is totally connected to this international capital. So for them also, the national interests are also not important. They want to make money, that's it. And that's why the state has to guide the process. So even though in some cases, the industrialization process has been built through the construction of, I'd better say, through tight links with this national elite in order for them to create the groups, national groups for the industrial sector and so on. Because otherwise, they will be totally connected to the international interests. Well, another topic. In some cases, coming back to the failures, in some cases, we had excessive protection of the industry with no stimulus for innovation. Okay, and this is also a problem, because at the end we have protected industry, but which could survive. This is nice, but which became extremely backward from a technological point of view. And this is also not good, obviously. So in this sense, it's important to keep the incitation for innovation. And then coming back to Ramon, also possibilities. The relation to universities is very important, research and development, or even competition. In China, competition between public companies. So in China, they based the industrialization process mostly in or strongly in public companies, but fomenting competition between the public companies within China, and also fostering innovation through other ways as well. Another important issue for the failure and for the possibilities, the need for scale. You all know the economy of scale, no? The bigger the production, the lower the average costs, obviously, all right? That's one of the reasons why China produces so cheap nowadays. It's not anymore related to very low wages. Wages in China are not anymore very low if compared to Mexican wages, for instance. But they produce for the whole world. So they have this economy of scale, which allows them, among other reasons, allows them to produce really cheap. And then we have to think about scale. And then, Ramon, it's very important for us to think about the regional cooperation, right? So in Brazil, regional cooperation within Latin America or within South America, and then in Africa, the same. Nkrumah in the 50s, he was already saying that it was absolutely necessary for Africa in order to develop industry to avoid national industrial policies, because it would be nonsense to produce an industry only for each of the more than 50 African states. So it would be better to think it regionally, okay? And then he and others developed the Pan-African idea and so on. So this is something really important as well, the regional chains, the regional integration. And then, well, just to finish and give you the floor again, the counterexample you gave, Ramon, of China cannot be copied, obviously. China is indeed a very specific country, but we do have things to learn with China. I mentioned the public financing, so public banks, several development banks they have in China. But for instance, the selective FDI, they do not accept, and historically, they went into a process of opening up their economy for FDI, but it was really gradual. And in the beginning, they were really, really selective. Okay, foreign capital can come to China, but to some specific sectors. Or you can come to China, but you, Honda, for instance, you can come to China to produce automobile, but you will buy inputs from Chinese companies. You will not buy inputs from Japanese companies, you see? So you impose some rules over the FDI in order to create good externalities for the economy. Obviously, research and development, this is absolutely necessary. This exchange manipulation, as I said in the beginning, is also important currently. In most Latin American countries, again, but not only, in most countries in which commodities are important for the international trade. Since we had the commodity boom in the first decade of this century, we had the appreciation of our currencies, of our money, right? So if our money is strong, paradoxically, it's bad for our industry. I guess you are familiar with that already. So it's important to have the exchange rate, first of all, stable, more or less stable. I'm not saying that we have to have fixed exchange rate. And if possible, in competitive level. China does it. And it's necessary if you want to think about industry. This issue about protection, but competition, right? So in order, or at least any way of fostering innovation. Another important issue, it's important to think about the configuration of big groups. So we have to think about the small companies, obviously, also for social reasons, for economic and social reasons, but unavoidably, capitalism depends also on big companies, and it depends on the country. But if possible, it's a good strategy to try to create some big groups, because they will compete internationally and so on. All right. So those are some of the issues that were made by China that can be tried to be not emulated, but at least learned from the peripheral countries as a whole. Because as you said, Ramon, and then I cannot avoid being pessimistic as well. Nowadays, it's not only necessary to industrialize. Industrialize is not the solution anymore. Because when we get into the global value or the global supply chains, so we industrialize our countries, but in these low value added tasks, it's not the solution. It can bring some amelioration in the welfare, but it's still it's a new division of labor, international division of labor, but within the same structure. In which just to say that nowadays it's even worse, because it's not only a matter of industrializing, but industrializing for the sake of the nation, for the welfare of the population. No? So I just try to give some possibilities, but I share with you this pessimistic view. I cannot avoid it.
Yes, very great. Yeah, it's a very interesting discussions. Actually, if you follow our whole week of the discussion on the industrial policy, you kind of, Professor Conti, is a kind of review of all the discussion we had. Like at last point, you're talking about have a stable exchange rate and also make it a little bit competitive. It's exactly as what we talked about yesterday. So that's very important, and I'm sorry, but already we accumulated quite a few questions here. And so before I pass the floor to Evelyn, here I want to, and some actually questions, Professor, you already answered, but let me just remind again. So from Hani, for the middle income countries such as the Philippines, which factors usually shape the choice of strategic sectors or industries to invest in or promote? Does the choice always have to entail losers and winners? And I mean, yeah, I think Ramon, your questions in the chat box are already being answered by the professor. So I will go to Mr. Sahu's question. You talked about the role of the FDI in industrial development. What about the role of foreign institutional investment? Which one is better? If you want some clarifications, you can also invite Mr. Sahu for his question. Since we have very limited time, so Evelyn, you can also take the floor. And I would hope if you could give our brief questions, then we have more time for the professor to answer. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make an observation in terms of the last comments towards China's approach to actually industrialize, where they insist companies should buy materials from their country. Now, funny enough, that is not the case when they come to other countries. I want to give an example of Uganda. During COVID-19, they were given opportunity to manufacture locally radios to help the children during lockdown to study. So originally they pretended they were actually assembling the parts here locally. only for the parliamentary committee to go to their factory and they're actually importing these products into the country, not doing what they promised to do. So for me, I feel that is kind of double standard, which should really not be acceptable.
Mm. Perfectly. So I can start with Evelyn. You are totally right. We have this kind of cases in Brazil as well. Actually, the Chinese capital, when it goes abroad, one of the reasons for that, at least in some sectors, is precisely to deal with the idle capacity they have in China. So in concrete terms, they buy some firms abroad, existing firms. So this is they do not create a new firm, they buy an existing firm in order to revert the demand of this existing firm to buy inputs from China. It happens. So we are totally right. At the end, they are doing their national strategy. They are doing their national policy. So you are totally right. Let me come to Honey. Let me ask Sahu, I don't know if I understood what we mean by foreign institutional investment.
Yes, Mr. Sahu, if you could elaborate a little bit, that would help us.
Hello, yeah. Basically, foreign institutional investments are basically investment in finances, like in the stock markets.
Okay.
This is what I understand.
Perfect.
So I hope, yeah.
Okay.
And these are short-term investment, and if there is some problem, the investor quickly,
Perfect. Okay, now I got it. So portfolio investments is the way I would mention it, but I totally understand now. And you are right. At the end, FDIs, even if we have a lot of problems, I mentioned it before, it's still better than receiving these portfolio investments or institutional investment, as you are mentioning, precisely because of the short-termism related to the portfolio investments. The portfolio investment is in bonds or equities, and then it can come to Brazil, let's say, today, and be repatriated the next week, just seeking for very high yields or valorization, all right? So it's a much more volatile investment. So still, it's better to receive a foreign direct investment than portfolio investment. You're totally right. Nowadays, because the foreign direct investment, if you buy less than 10% of a company, the shares of a company, it's considered as portfolio investment. More than 10%, it's FDI. So just to let you know that sometimes we have an FDI, what we consider to be an FDI, but it has the characteristics of the portfolio investment as well. But whenever we have money coming to construct a company, it's better than money coming just to speculate in the stock market, all right? And then just to finish, because I guess we are running out of time with Honey, I would say, Honey, obviously, I don't know the specific case of Philippines, but I would say for all countries, the strategic sector, the most strategic sector is capital goods. So machines, producing the capital goods. So this has to be at least the goal, let's say, not for the short term, but for the medium to long term. Again, the example of China is good because this is what they tried to do, and they succeeded. We have it's better for the countries if they can produce then their own machines, their own capital good, because more than the other sectors within industry, this is where the most important technological developments happen, and also due to sovereignty, because if you have problems with international trade, if you produce your own machines, then it's better than depending on imports. So the strategic sector, as you said, your question was about the strategic sector, and I would say it's the one related to capital goods. Okay.
Very great. Give me also the chance, because I have many questions as well. But I think we are running out of time. So let me try to remind everyone, or maybe a little bit provocation. when we're talking about the whole week of industrial policies, I think it's also better for every of us to think a little bit of what is actually industrial policies. Does it actually very controversial? Because in the beginning, as Professor Conti already mentioned, there are some ideologies within the situation. If the definition of industrial policy can be per se problematic, then the ideologies can also play a bigger role. And as we know, that's also part of the answer when the developed countries already kick the with a ladder, which we all already know as developing countries, but still they are managed to do so because there are some kind of things are still the ideology play a role. So I think these are the questions maybe we didn't much talk about during this whole week session. And so that's it. And thank you, everyone, especially thanks to Professor Conti for such a very excellent debate and the conversations. We all enjoy a lot. And of course, we have more and more questions. And I'm sorry, guys, I cannot really ask now. But we can also keep in touch. And there are so many research of Professor Bruno Conti you can always find online. And yes, thank you again very much. Thanks to Professor Conti.
Okay, just put my mail address. If any of you want to send me a question directly, I'll be happy to respond. Okay, we can keep in touch. Thanks a lot, Chen-Li. Thanks a lot, Edlira. And thanks a lot for all very good questions. It was very nice for me.